who's a research associate at the Institute of Sustainable Resources, and her background is in ethnography and anthropology. And we've had a request to say, could we dim the lights at the front just so the slides are a bit clearer? Maybe so. We might just need to do that. Hi, right, so I'm going to follow on from David. I was doing the other part of the research, the qualitative research, so going out and talking to people and seeing how they were making sense of this range of sort of philosophical, social theory and guidelines in how they go about practicing research at the moment in the built environment faculty here at UCL. So my aim was really to collect experience of and reflections of ethics of built environment research. And the brief was really to try and cover the three core areas of UCL's activity: research, teaching and enterprise. And also to cover the multidisciplinary nature of all the different types of built environment research that go on here. So today I've carried out 17 interviews, and I just wanted to sort of show the range of different departments that are grouped underneath the Bartlett, and I also sort of spoke to two people who are at the faculty level and two people who are part of Central UCL to get their perspectives on not only processes and procedures of ethics that they use, but also just how their experiences have generated their own interpretation of ethics, with the idea that we could share examples to help other people think about these questions. So really through interviews there were four areas that people were talking about: the process and procedures, also changes over time both within the institution, within people's own personal research practice, but also sort of in relation to broader society. And then there were some specific themes that were coming out of their research practice and specific examples to try and make sense of the kind of range of diverse different experiences, thoughts and experiences. I've been drawing out these sort of 6 key issues that come out when people talk about ethics. Firstly, these are in sort of order of how frequently they appeared. So firstly is the question of relationships, and that refers to institutional relationships that are generated through research. So from accepting funding to do setting research agendas, working on different projects, but also relationships within research teams, so between PI and research associate, for example. And these sort of filter into how people understand and define ethics, and whether there's anything specific about built environment research which might generate different types of ethical questions. The third sort of key issue that comes out is data and methods, and I was particularly interested to see lots of people talking about observations as a sort of key method being used, observation monitoring, and how that ostensibly could be seen as not creating a problem, but how it is not creating any sort of particular ethical issues, but how it does generate some ethical issues. So I'll talk to those three and end with an example of sort of ethical concerns coming up through using observational techniques. But sort of throughout all these conversations were questions of responsibility, vulnerability and awareness were coming up when people talked. So just to map out the first thing, this was the kind of relationships that people were discussing when they were navigating kind of the ethical relationship, the ethics that came out of research relationships. So it's the university's sort of changing relationship to external trends such as increasing awareness of diversity, which means forms of harm could be multiplied and hard to understand. Changes coming in from the higher education sector, like the Concord Act, which we've heard about, but also the sort of increasing drive for universities to be more entrepreneurial. And then also there was an understanding of UCL's own sort of identity as an institution that creates socially relevant research, and how that shapes the kind of nature of influence and action that people are trying to achieve through their research. So given this sort of landscape of relationships, one researcher then pointed out how ethical issues are constantly emerging and changing, and you have to make sure that the process of engaging with ethics questions is dynamic enough to allow researchers to be able to manage these types of relationships, to think through the impacts of these types of relationships. But it wasn't just from a sort of personal research perspective. There's also people referring to the kind of the social conscience of the institution, and how the institutional framework enables an institutional layer of ethics. So one researcher was talking about that large-scale projects are done according to who pays for it, and these represent particular interest groups such as governments or corporations, and there are groups that are systematically neglected, and that UCL as an institution has a responsibility to consider the full portfolio of research and try and address any imbalances or distortions through its own resources or others' resources which have access to that. And for some researchers, this creates an ethics within the institution that enables academic freedom to allow the individual to follow their own personal ethics. So one researcher was discussing the decision not to accept funding from certain bodies to work on different projects, and explained that the whole point of doing research is to have highly motivated people working on issues that they find challenging and relevant, and that the university has created this envious position of not having to earn money from shareholders, and that provides what they considered the luxury of ethics. For others, the institutional framework didn't generate the same sorts of academic freedom. So another person was describing how when they first arrived, they were stunned by the sort of transformation of themselves into the role of expert. As they explained, the institution sets people up like that and supports people to be experts in their field. And that creates a disjuncture if you subscribe to a view that knowledge is developed more relationally. Because what comes with the expert is a certain story of ethics and a certain way of performing ethics. And it's hard to perform other identities when you're pulled into that. And people, particularly the students, don't want you to devalue expert knowledge. It's not just students, it's also public, government, corporations, the clients want to know that the built environment have the certainty of the expert knowledge that the built environment will be a haven and not a hazard, which raises the question of whether there's something specific about built environment research that creates specific questions, specific ethical issues that don't come up in other disciplines which don't focus on the built environment. This was an ambivalent question. Some people didn't think that there was anything that would happen in the Bartlett that could create any form of harm, because at base the kinds of harm that you can do to people are fundamental. And therefore, this researcher was talking about the idea that ethics needs to just be the question that the person asks, am I going to do any damage to the person, either sort of through reputation, economically, physically, mentally, and if you can answer that question, then you can understand the ethical implications of the research that you're doing. But for others, they were much more interested in the sort of agentive potential of the built environment. So one researcher pointed out that when you start to engage with the environment as not just a setting for social action, but something that has a direct influence, then you come to understand the impact on communities and on future generations that's created through architecture and the built environment. And these are people who are involved in the process of production, and therefore built environment professions have a particular responsibility. So this kind of trying to define whether there's something specific about built environment research showed up two key ambivalences: whether built environment research is a coherent disciplinary space, which requires its own types of questions, or whether it can import the ethical procedures and processes and thought processes that come with the methods and data sets that it uses, or whether the other sort of key area of ambivalence was around this sort of focus on medical ethics, medical research ethics as a framework, because as sort of David mentioned, this can obscure the types of harm if you're engaging with the built environment as something that does have agentic potential. Then that can be obscured by the very specific form of harm that is embedded in the concept of medical research ethics, of direct intervention to a person. However, other people pointed out that medical research ethics has enabled the medical research profession to have a license to operate with data and with information in a way that built environment professionals don't have. There's a level of using sort of private individual data that the medical research profession has access to, because they have developed an ethics procedure that gives sort of state and broader society confidence in the processes and also the attention to ethical questions that have gone into creating the ethics framework. But just to finish on one quick example, so this idea that the kind of harm that could be created through the built environment can be obscured if you focus very specifically on intervening in a person. And this example comes from someone who's doing a performance monitoring test, and as they explained, all the research I do is clearly exempt from ethical questions because I only monitor the performance of the building fabric. None of my research involves interacting with the occupants or the people who own the building. However, they went on to point out that actually this framework, this way of thinking, doesn't help you deal with the kind of ethics that can come up through this kind of research. So in this case, they were talking about the monitoring reveals high levels of damp and mould and rot, which has a negative impact on someone's health. So then suddenly they found themselves in a position, having found something they weren't expecting, such as mold growth. The research turned from being monitoring into actually needing to engage with people and to tell them what might be a health impact. And this is more than just the kind of, how do I go about telling the resident they might be in danger, but it's what kind of power dynamics are going on between the landlord and the tenant, and who do you work with, the housing provider or with the tenants? With the housing provider find it easier to get rid of the tenant than it would be to get rid of the problem. There are questions around losing the research that if you continued you would understand more about the performance of the building even though you were letting it degrade. And then there's the broader responsibility, because this issue around performance monitoring came up from a number of people, and the broader responsibility is whether you're working with, say, built environment professionals or the sector, whether you penalise people who engage with the research process, who allow researchers to come in and allow sort of transparency and access, and whether if you find a problem, whether you could damage that negotiated relationship to be able to research, or whether you're able to bring the profession with you, whether there's a sort of endemic problem within the sector around performance, you might jeopardise your ability to first find out the extent of that problem and then to bring the sector with you. So sort of running out of time, but this sort of idea of monitoring and observation came up from a lot of different perspectives, not just around sort of building physics, but also from more performance and practice led, where the idea that if you're documenting people's behaviour, people's performance in a specific type of place and representing them as a specific group of person, then that might expose them to certain forms of harm or vulnerability when you move away from that space or out of that identity. So sort of the range of concerns around methods and data just showed that there was uncertainty of the nature of harm that can be generated through research, both to researchers and to participants, sort of certain ambivalences and consent and access to data. Just to quickly summarise, sort of the three key points that came out of the interviews really is that built environment is increasingly recognised as productive of social action, and when you accept that you can generate different thoughts of ethical questions. That ethical relationships generated between not only current but also future generations, which mean that you again have a different framework in which to evaluate and understand the implications of the research you're doing, and also the key methods of monitoring and observation open new ethical issues as understandings of responsibility and vulnerability are broadened. And so, as one person pointed out occasionally, it's just much harder to think about where the consequences of what we do might go.